There are stories that fade with time, and there are stories that return years later, heavier and impossible to ignore. This is one of them. Not the story of a headline you've read, but the story of a woman named Eleanor Vance, a name that could belong to any actress who gave Hollywood her youth and got silence in return. At 62, Eleanor is finally speaking with a clarity she never had in her 20s, 30s, or even 40s. For the first time, she is willing to talk about what really happened behind the closed doors of her second marriage. The one the tabloids called a fairy tale, the one that nearly destroyed her. When Eleanor met Julian Cole, she was 40, freshly divorced, and still gathering the pieces of a decade-long marriage that had ended in exhaustion rather than fire. Julian was 25. He was warm in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Attentive, funny, endlessly curious about her life, her scars, her children. Their first conversation lasted most of a night. It felt less like flirtation and more like recognition, as if two people who had been waiting for the right listener had finally found one. Within weeks, Julian had met her daughters. He even, in an almost unheard-of gesture, built an easy rapport with her ex-husband. The blended family photos that later circulated seemed to prove what everyone wanted to believe, that love could, in fact, rewrite the rules. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony upstate. The press called them Hollywood's most unlikely success story. Behind the cameras, though, a private grief had already taken root. Before the wedding, Eleanor had lost a pregnancy at 6 months. She and Julian had already picked a name. She never spoke about it publicly for years, and when she finally did, she described a guilt that never fully left her, the kind that convinces you the loss was somehow your fault, even when reason says otherwise. That grief became the first quiet fracture in their marriage, long before anyone on the outside noticed a thing. Grief has a way of reorganizing a person from the inside. Eleanor, who had spent nearly 2 decades staying sober after a difficult young adulthood, found herself slipping. A drink to get through an anniversary, a pill to sleep, then another. What began as small, private lapses slowly became a pattern she couldn't outrun. Julian, for his part, responded the way many people do when a partner is drowning and they don't know how to swim out to them. He pulled back. Not cruelly, not all at once, but steadily, the way tide goes out. The man who had once felt like her rescue now felt like a stranger in the next room. Eleanor later admitted, in interviews she gave well into her 50s, that during this period she made choices she wasn't proud of, not because she wanted to, but because she was terrified of losing him. She described bending herself into whatever shape she thought a younger, more modern partner might want, and feeling smaller every time she did. It's a familiar story, if an uncomfortable one. The fear of abandonment can make people agree to things that erode them, piece by piece, long before there's any single dramatic betrayal to point to. By year 6 of the marriage, Eleanor was, in her own later words, holding on by a thread. She was still showing up to premieres, still smiling in photographs, while privately rehearsing the sentence she was most afraid to say out loud. This isn't working. The end, when it came, wasn't a single explosive moment, so much as an accumulation. Late nights that stretched later, explanations that stopped quite making sense, a coldness that crept into ordinary conversations. She has said she knew before she let herself know, which is its own particular kind of loneliness. When a marriage publicly ended, there was no scandal to point to, no easy villain for the tabloids to name. Just two people who had let real distance grow in the space where intimacy used to live. Eleanor has said that this ambiguity was, in some ways, harder than a clean betrayal would have been. There was no single wound to blame, just the slow erosion of two people who had once talked for 8 hours straight and somehow arrived, years later, at silence. What followed the divorce wasn't relief. It was free fall. Eleanor has spoken since about a period in her early 50s that she barely remembers clearly. Nights blurred by drinking, days lost to a punishing, self-punishing relationship with food and exercise, a body she no longer recognized in the mirror. She has described a night when her heart's rhythm went dangerously wrong at a gathering in her own home, an experience frightening enough that it became, in retrospect, a kind of rock bottom. The people closest to her, especially her daughters, bore the weight of watching someone they loved disappear into a version of herself they didn't recognize. She has said, with the particular honesty that only comes years later, that her children distanced themselves for their own protection, and that she understood why, even as it broke her heart. There were birthdays she missed, milestones she wasn't present for, even when she was in the room. The silence between her and her daughters stretched for years. Rehab helped, but only partially. The deeper repair, the kind that rebuilds trust, took far longer. It wasn't therapy alone or sobriety alone that brought her back. It was, she has said, her daughters choosing, each in their own time, to reach for her again. As Eleanor slowly rebuilt her life, she started doing something she hadn't done in years, telling the truth, first to herself, then to the people closest to her, and eventually to the public. It wasn't really about naming a single betrayal. The truth she'd been protecting for over a decade was quieter and, in some ways, more painful than any headline could capture. It was this. She had let herself be convinced, slowly and almost invisibly, that she wasn't enough as she was. Not young enough, not flexible enough, not endlessly accommodating enough to keep someone's attention. She has said that comments about age, framed as jokes, chipped away at her sense of herself in ways she didn't fully register until much later. That she talked herself into accepting things she never would have accepted at an earlier point in her life, not out of desire, but out of fear. For years, even after the marriage ended, she stayed quiet about all of it. She didn't want to hurt Julian publicly. She didn't want to unravel the parts of their story that had been genuinely good. So she protected his image, and in doing so, kept protecting the silence that had cost her so much. It wasn't until her late 50s, and more fully at 62, that she let herself say these things plainly, not as an act of revenge, but as an act of reclamation. By the time Eleanor reached her early 60s, her life looked almost unrecognizable compared to the years of collapse. Not because the past had been erased, but because she'd finally made peace with carrying it honestly instead of hiding it. Julian, for his part, has said publicly in the years since that he doesn't hold any ill will toward her, and that the divorce made him feel, for a long time, like he had failed at something important, especially given what they'd lost together early on. His words didn't rewrite the past, but they added something the story had been missing. Proof that both people had walked away wounded, not just one. In a surprising turn, Eleanor eventually built a warm, easy friendship with Julian's second wife. The two women have joked publicly about their strange, overlapping histories and the ordinary humanity of it. Two women who might have been cast as rivals choosing something gentler instead, became its own quiet statement about what maturity can look like. And then, more recently, Eleanor began speaking with real openness about the deepest part of what she'd lived through. Not the specific incidents, but the slow self-erasure. How she'd given away her boundaries a little at a time in the name of being loved. How she'd lost herself long before she lost the marriage. She calls what she has now solo partnering. A commitment to being whole on her own terms, rather than looking to another person to complete something she now understands was never actually missing. At 62, Eleanor Vance's real revelation wasn't about anyone else's darkest secret. It was her own. That silence, more than heartbreak, had cost her the most. And that choosing, finally, to speak had been the last and most important step in getting herself back. Her story, fictional but built from very real and very human patterns, is a reminder that even people who seem to have everything can lose themselves inside a relationship, and that finding your way back is possible, no matter how many years the silence lasted. A note on this. Eleanor Vance and Julian Cole are fictional characters. I wrote this as an invented story rather than a factual account of any real people, since I can't present unverified private details about real individuals as fact. If you'd like, I can also do a short, clearly labeled factual piece using only what Demi has actually said in her own memoir and interviews, with proper attribution. Just let me know.